Uh, Hello, my name is Jack Fleming, and this video is going to be, ouch, directed more on Task 2 of Creative Arts Research. I'm going to be assessing and evaluating primary and secondary sources. Okay, so first off, what are they? So a primary source is essentially an original piece of creative or intellectual property. So that can be a song, an article, a book, that sort of thing. Whereas a secondary source is something based off of that. So an analysis of a song or a cover of a song, something that's purely based off the primary source, that is a secondary source. Okay, so I'm just going to say this out flat now. It's essentially, when you're doing a research subject, it's essentially impossible not to use primary sources because you need a basis, you need something to stem from. And especially with something like mine, combining genres, I particularly find that, very hard to do. It's quite difficult not to use primary sources because you need examples of music, you need songs. So, and primary sources are very effective because especially when you're doing your research subject, it really directs you towards the right direction. Not saying secondary sources don't, but it makes sure that you're staying relevant throughout the research and how you are doing it exactly. So there's a lot of uses to primary sources, not only for that, but it keeps you grounded and makes sure you're aiming right, because there's a lot of so I find primary sources extremely useful for that, to make sure you're not getting convoluted by opinions. Okay, so let's move on to secondary sources for a bit. Secondary sources for me for this project have been very mixed. They've been very useful for me researching ska punk, a bit hit and miss for folk metal, and pretty much absolutely useless for Mr. Bungle. So essentially, secondary source they tend to mostly be theories or opinions, and I don't really have much of a use for opinions and theories for the basis of my project. I'm mainly looking for facts and solid evidence. I have to admit, they have been very useful for ska punk because I did a bit of research on both the ska and punk genres, and they have been very useful for analysing the social and political, political and social, I'm trying to find the right word, I'm sorry, the kind of meaning it had then about bringing black people with white people and stuff like that, about how it was a very beautiful thing to happen. And and that's totally cool, because most of these opinions I've actually gotten through the online and real world were people that were actually there. However, for folk metal, it's actually been very useless for the most part. Throughout research, I've actually the generic idea of folk metal is that it originated from Scandinavia. That's the generic idea. But throughout research, I went on this website that actually kind of proved that that's actually not true. The first folk metal band was a band called Sky Claude, and they're English. So this is a website that has basically every single folk metal album out ever, and it has the dates where, you know, kind of how the dates of when they were formed and stuff, and you'll find that Sky Claude are the earliest. See, 1990, 95, and 91. This band are folk metal, and they are older than Sky Claude, but you'll find there that, they're black metal. They started out as a black metal band, and then they became folk metal. So, and yeah. So a lot of people, there are a few Scandinavian bands, but it's generally nowhere near as Scandinavian as it's made out to be. I actually have a friend who's in a folk metal band, and they are generally hell-bent on believing it's Scandinavian. It kind of gives a cool effect because it makes these bands use Scandinavian mythology and stuff within their lyric work. But, however, the general beliefs are false. Yeah, it started by a band in Newcastle. So, yeah. And the influences, because one of the members, I believe he's called Martin Walkler. I probably butchered the name, but essentially he did a bit of world traveling and, used a lot of European mythologies. And, he used that as his lyrics, and he fused that with his use of English puns. And he mainly took a German influence. He didn't really have much of an interest for the Scandinavians. So yeah, I found it very convoluted there. And, and there was this other side which was quite, well, it was more of a forum by this woman called Stephanie. The site's called Steph Metal. It's pronounced STUFF. I believe she's from New Zealand, so the strange spelling might have something to do with that. She has a master's in journalism, and she's a metal enthusiast, and basically she kind of regurgitates what a lot of that information is, that, 1990, how they gained their folk influences, and, about what that did. Now, there was an interview with Steve Ransby, who is the original and still remaining guitarist of that band. And essentially what he said was, we sort of created folk metal by definition, but there was music such as Celtic rock and stuff like that already out there. So sure, they created what is folk metal, but like he said, there was other sounds like that out there. And that is a very debatable thing, whether we're just looking at folk metal. So I found secondary sources very weak with folk metal. Some of them have been solid and strong, but yeah, they just kind of really it sort of became like Chinese whispers, really, where the points became very convoluted from the primary source. And with Mr. Bungle, the secondary sources haven't been helpful whatsoever. The reason why that is because there's a lot of opinions as to why they do it. And since all these opinions and theories are so different, and really nothing really stems from those opinions and theories, there's really nothing to go on. All you really kind of have are the interviews of Mike Pratton. Now, there are two very interesting interviews from Mr. Mike Patton. Now, if you don't, I've probably already mentioned this, but Mr. Genre, yes, Mr. Genre, the master of all genres, Mr. Bungle are it's quite hard to describe them, but they're a multi-genred experimental avant-garde band. Essentially, they use a lot of influences, and essentially, in one interview, Mike Patton said that he doesn't like music. This was when he was in his mid-20s, and he's basically said, I don't enjoy music how I used to. It's just passed from the sounds being regurgitated, and whenever I'm in vinyl shops, I usually look at background music because that type of music can't disappoint you. And that's what he said. And in another interview, when he was being interviewed, and the interviewer said, so what genre is this? Mr. Patton literally just replied with yes. So obviously he's not too sure of the identity of the music himself. But in one of those interviews, he had mentioned that Mr. Bungle is essentially his idea of creating real music. So he's essentially using a lot of, like, you can clearly hear from his music, you know, the primary source, that he's using loads and loads and loads of influences, and, you know, you don't need to analyze it to understand that. You can hear it straight. But this is kind of why, like, your primary sources should be valued a bit more than the secondary sources, I believe, because secondary sources tend to be, well, they can be opinions and theories, and opinions and theories can be made by anyone. Like, I could come up with a theory right now saying that everyone in the Scottish government are all secretly lizards that eat grass and thrive on sewage water, you know? But that's just a theory, you know what I mean? And I could also make the opinion saying that, you know, I could also make the opinion saying that like something like Walker's crisps are bad. It's not fact. There are loads of people that like Walker's crisps. So the fact that I say it's bad doesn't make it bad, you know? It's not really even up to public opinion, really. It's just kind of how you make of it. How you personally make of it doesn't really... And especially that kind of thing is sort of really invalid for like, you know, academic work. So that's kind of what I think of secondary sources. I don't think they're completely invalid, because like I said, they have been really useful investigating ska punk, you know, like the Caribbean heritage and stuff like that. And, you know, what it meant to have that kind of influence in the UK and the US, you know? However, since there were people actually there and actually could explain what they've seen in great detail, and, you know, it is true because there were people around, you know? Whereas, if you think about it, there's no actual solid evidence that, you know, you don't get any Scandinavian people from the 90s or the 80s being like, oh yeah, I remember folk metal when it was made. Like, no. Actually, and you'll find out actually that Scandinavians actually really like music from the bands such as Radiohead and Alt J. So clearly they've got a taste for British alternative music, you know? And that's very different from folk metal. Like, but, and you know, the Scandinavians don't claim that alternative music is Russian or something, so therefore they must use Russian phrases, like Suka Bled or something like that. But yeah, I can definitely see how secondary sources would be useful, because if you are investigating something really kind of non-linear but specific at the same time, let's say like the acting techniques of Jim Carrey, there's a lot of opinions about the way how he acts and whether it's experimental or just really Adam Sandler-ish. And technically, like you can't disprove them, which is kind of the nature of opinions and theories. You can test them, but you can't prove them or disprove them. So that kind of makes, in academic research studies, it kind of makes it sort of invalid if you aren't using concepts. That's why, that's why I kind of am sort of using more or less conceptual theory, a conceptual framework rather than a theoretical one. I'm analysing concepts, I'm analysing things that are indeed there and are real, not what people think. Unless they stem from the primary source, because, Mike Patton thinking all modern music is bad and terrible. It is opinion, but however, it does relate to kind of the way how he makes music in Mr. Bungle. He sort of seems to kind of take influences from everywhere and anywhere and everywhere. It's his version of good music. I just did it. His version of good music. So he's not wrong, but he's not necessarily right. However, it is a primary source because he is the front man of what I am studying. So, yeah. So, primary sources essentially are very effective if you are mainly based on concepts, such as me. However, secondary sources might be more useful if you're using a theoretical framework, because if you look at there are a lot of like theories and stuff like that online, on YouTube especially, you kind of need opinions, really. Like there's a lot of opinions about certain laws and stuff like that. There's a YouTuber called Count Dankula. Yeah. And he's great for that, and he's great at kind of really seeing it from all sides, but he's also great at inserting his own opinion, about how, I won't go too much into detail because that's a little bit irrelevant, secondary sources. But yeah, that is what it's not really my opinion, it's just what I've experienced, so get on.